For the last few weeks of class, we'll be talking about the human body. This week we'll be covering chapters 20, 21, and 22, selections from them. Next week is Thanksgiving break, so we'll just go over 23 and parts of 24, and then the last week we'll be finishing up 24 through 26. Learning objectives for chapter 20 is sections just 1 and 6, and knowing how do animal structures reflect their functions. We've talked about this before, form follows function in the context of cells, but now we're going to be talking about bigger things like entire animal structures. So when I say form follows function, it's a simple statement, but it captures one of the most universal relationships in the living world. Think about planes. There's different types of planes. So in the case of jumbo jets, their form is really big. Their function is to carry a lot of people. Whereas fighter jets, their form is sleek and much lighter and smaller, and their function is not to carry a lot of people. Here's an example for fast-swimming organisms from penguins to tuna to sharks. They share a common streamlined body shape. Okay? So that's how form follows function. If a structure is adaptive, meaning it's a product of natural selection, that process we talked about, then its physical features closely relate to its function. Animal bodies are multicellular, and perhaps the chief benefit of multicellularity is that it makes possible a division of labor and specialization at the cellular level, meaning it's unnecessary for each cell to carry out every single process. Instead, cells can be organized into groups, and groups organized into larger groups to carry out specific life-sustaining functions such as exchanging gases between the organism and its environment, thinking and feeling, and fighting pathogens. So you should know all these different levels: cell, tissue, organ, and organ system. Also know that the cells that form different tissues, all cells have the exact same DNA. All cells in humans have the same 46 chromosomes. It's what genes are going to be actively turned on or off that's going to make a muscle cell differ from a liver cell, which we talked about this with cell chapters, but just want to remind you in case it came up on a test. One of the fundamental features of the animal body is its organization. In most animals, groups of cells with similar structure, along with some products of those cells, form tissues. Tissues in which the cells act together to perform specific functions in the body. Adult animals generally have 4 main types of tissue: connective, epithelial, muscle, and nervous. Connective tissue provides structure and support. It anchors cells. Epithelial tissue, like that's what's found on your skin. There are cells that cover and line most surfaces, and also line organs like the lungs, digestive tract, etc. Muscle tissue is composed of cells that can contract and generate movement. And nervous tissue are composed of specialized cells that can send and receive messages and store information. So you'll find different types of tissue in the same organ. Like in the case of the heart, you're going to find not just one type of tissue, but different types. So tissues are grouped into organs, and then those are further grouped into organ systems. This is just the definition of organs. Again, structures that serve specialized function, and remember that they can contain several or even all 4 of those different tissue types. So know those tissue types, and know that you're not limited to just one for every single organ. You can have up to all 4 of them in the same organ. And then organ systems are just groups of organs that work together to accomplish the same function. Go ahead and answer the question. Pause it if you need to. The answer is all of the above. Alright, animal bodies are highly organized. You have cells, tissues, organs, and organ systems, and there are 4 types of tissue. Each organ system performs special tasks. So for the rest of this chapter 20, I'm just going to give you an overview of all of those different organ systems, and then in the subsequent chapters we're going to talk about some of them. We don't have time to cover every single one, but I'm going to highlight the ones I've found the most important for you to know about. What you should know about an organ system is that these are systems that interact to support the growth, development, maintenance, and reproduction of the entire organism. And there are 11 major systems. There is, of course, the digestive system, which breaks apart food and then absorbs food so that the body can acquire nutrients it needs to function. Circulatory system transports nutrients and respiratory gases to the tissue and eliminates waste from the tissue. So everyone knows about your heart and your blood, but I don't think a lot of people think about what its job is. Its job is to take oxygen that we breathe in through our lungs and pass it through our entire body to all the cells that need that oxygen to do respiration. And then what circulatory system also does is it takes all the carbon dioxide, which is that byproduct of respiration, that we breathe out and returns it to the lungs to breathe it back out and get it out of our system. But we'll talk about that and how the circulatory system interacts with the respiratory system. Respiratory system provides a site for gas exchange between the external environment and the organism. The nervous system acts as a control center of the body. Very important job in interpreting and storing information. We have the reproductive system, both female and male. Females, of course, produce eggs and provide an environment for nurturing a developing embryo. Male reproductive system's sole job is to produce the sperm and deliver that to the female reproductive system for fertilization. The immune system and the lymphatic system. Most people probably haven't heard of the lymphatic system, but its job is important. Much like the immune system, it attacks pathogens that threaten the body, and it plays a supporting role in circulation by recycling fluid that leaks from the circulatory system. So your lymphatic system is kind of like a circulatory plus immune system hybrid. We're unfortunately not going to get to talk about it very much, but know that it is an organ system. There is the urinary and excretory system, the kidneys, which purifies the blood by filtering out wastes. So again, a lot of people don't know what your kidneys do. In part, they're going to filter out waste products. Endocrine system is important for all of the hormones that are released through your body and send signals through your whole body. This can include your brain, obviously, but also your thyroid glands. Integumentary system, that's your skin, essentially. Provides protective barrier between the inside and outside of an organism. In addition to your skin, that's also going to include hair and nails. You have the skeletal system. Supports and protects the body and internal organs. The muscular system generates force through contraction, which enables movement of the body and every other substance throughout the body. So that's the 11. In nearly all animals, some tissues are organized into organs that serve specialized functions and consist of multiple tissue types. Those organs have been organized into organ systems that carry out processes necessary for growth, development, maintenance, and reproduction. Moving right along, chapter 21. This is where we talk about respiration, the organ system of respiration, and then the organ system of circulation and how they relate to each other. Your book had circulation sections before respiration sections. I'm going to flip-flop it and introduce respiration to you first. I think it makes more sense. So we'll discuss the functioning of the respiratory system and explain how the circulatory system distributes material throughout the body. And most important is understand the relationship between the two. There's more sections for this chapter. You need to know 12 through 13, 15, 17, 1, 4 and 5, 9, 8, and 10. It looks like I lost some text here, sorry. The respiratory system of land animals like ourselves move oxygen-rich air into the lungs and carbon dioxide rich air out of the lungs. Remember, respiration is a process that happens in every cell. It produces ATP, which is all the energy currency that every cell uses. So you have to breathe in oxygen and get that through your whole body so that every cell can do respiration. And then you have to breathe out, dump out carbon dioxide, which is that byproduct of respiration that's kind of useless and we don't need it anymore, so we just need to get it out of our system. Oxygen and carbon dioxide must get into and out of the circulatory system. In single-celled and very small multicellular organisms, gas exchange can occur directly through diffusion. But in large multicellular organisms like humans, gas exchange becomes a two-stage process. First comes the exchange between the external environment and the organ's circulatory system, and then later comes the exchange between the circulatory system and the cells involved in respiration. Take-home message: oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. They must be exchanged. We've talked about hemoglobin before in the context of sickle cell. So remember, if there's a mutation in the DNA, you have a misshapen hemoglobin protein, and hemoglobin is important in red blood cells to maintain their shape, so that if they're mutated, the red blood cell gets a sickle shape. But they're also really important for carrying oxygen. That's where the real importance comes in, and that's why people with sickle cell disease have such disastrous side effects. You can think of hemoglobin like an oxygen shuttle bus, transporting oxygen throughout the body. Hemoglobin is a tiny molecule, so tiny there are about 250 million copies of hemoglobin in every single red blood cell. But right inside the blood cell, the hemoglobin remains there for the cell's entire life. Each molecule of hemoglobin is a tangled mass of 4 protein chains, and nestled within that cozy compartment of those 4 chains is where an iron is at, and iron attaches to oxygen that we breathe in so that it can diffuse into the red blood cell, temporarily making it part of the hemoglobin. This is why a shortage of iron in your diet can lead to anemia. We'll talk about anemia later. Because if iron is anemia is caused by a short supply of iron, and if iron is in short supply, then you get less oxygen that is bound to hemoglobin, and so less oxygen would be transported by each of those red blood cells, ultimately causing those disease traits of anemia like muscles and organs to be starved of oxygen, leading to that feeling of fatigue and weakness. So know that hemoglobin consists of it's a protein, it's a shuttle bus that has iron in it that shuttles oxygen around bound to iron. Mammalian respiration begins with a deep breath. So let's trace the air through the respiratory process. If you breathe in right now, air enters through the nose, filling the nasal cavity, where it becomes warm and moist. Additionally, air can be taken in through the mouth. In either case, the 2 entry points join together at the throat, which is also called the pharynx, which is at the back of your mouth. The air passes through the throat and moves through the voice box or vocal cords, also called the larynx. The voice box can be seen as the bump on the front of your neck, especially if you're a man. It's called an Adam's apple. So the Adam's apple is actually your larynx. From the larynx, the air moves into the trachea. You may have heard it called the windpipe before. The trachea is a long tube that takes the air into the chest cavity. And then once there, the trachea branches into 2 smaller tubes called bronchi. One of those go to the left lung and the other is going to go to the right lung. Those bronchi further subdivide into tiny little bronchioli. So think how you have like tiny sticks poking out of big sticks on top of a tree that started with just one big trunk, which in this analogy would be your trachea. And at the end of those bronchioli, we see these alveoli. So when the bronchi enter the lungs, those two bronchi, remember, one goes each lung, it enters the lungs, and the lungs are like a stretchy, elastic bag. And those bronchi keep branching, like you just saw, again and again and again. With successive branching, those bronchi get smaller and smaller, those bronchioli. Under certain size is when they're called bronchioli, and they all just keep branching and spreading out. If you ever get the opportunity to feel a human lung, they're surprisingly light. There's a lot of air pockets in them. Anyway, they just keep branching and spreading out, and eventually they reach a dead end. These dead ends are tiny elastic sacs, which are the alveoli, and it is here that the air meets the blood vessels. So if the respiratory system and the circulatory system interact, you might think, how the heck do they relate to each other? Well, they relate to each other right here. So the air comes in through the windpipe, it branches out through those two bronchi, and then all those bronchioli, and then they end up in the alveoli. And the alveoli are right next to the blood vessels, so that's where that oxygen that we breathe in is going to get exchanged into the blood vessel, grabbed up by those red blood cells, and then transported through your body. Vice versa, the blood vessels are then close to deliver carbon dioxide in other places in the lungs. Alright, so carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood into the alveoli and then out of the body as you exhale. And then inhaled oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into the blood when you inhale. So which structure in the lung facilitates direct exchange of gases with the circulatory system? The answer is, of course, number 4, because we just talked about it. This is just summarizing the respiration process. What controls the flow of air into and out of the lungs is what we'll talk about next, and that structure is the diaphragm, which is a really thick muscle. In reptiles, birds, and mammals, breathing occurs in 2 steps, inhalation and exhalation. The chest cavity is bordered on the bottom of it by a large sheet of muscle called a diaphragm, which separates the chest cavity from the abdominal cavity. The rest of the chest cavity above the diaphragm is surrounded by the rib cage and some other muscles between the ribs. During inhalation, the diaphragm contracts. Alright? So think about that. The diaphragm contracts when you breathe in. So you can probably feel your diaphragm right now under your rib cage. So have a dramatic breath in and feel what happens to it. Kind of contracts. When it contracts, it's pulled downwards, and the ribs cage expands, causing a rapid increase in the volume of the chest cavity in the lungs, which allows air to be sucked into the lungs. Then when the diaphragm relaxes after the contraction, it's going to relax. The chest cavity is going to return to its original size, and the reduction in volume compresses the lungs to force air back out. So which does not occur during inhalation? The answer is number 1. So the opposite is true. So when you inhale, again, the diaphragm muscle contracts. The intercostal muscles, those are just the muscles between the rib cage, the ribs and your rib cage. When the diaphragm contracts, it's pulled lower and that whole rib cage expands so those lungs can swell up and pull in air. So know the 2 steps, understand that whole process with the diaphragm and the lungs and the chest cavity. Alright, that's yellow, so you can't really see the text. Sorry about that. So this says, what is the circulatory system and why is it needed? The evolution of large body sizes opened up a world of new niches in which organisms could live, but large body size created a host of new challenges. With increasing size, most of an animal's cells were no longer in direct contact with the outside world. And the outside world is how the animal obtains its oxygen, nutrients, water, and all substances it needs to survive. So essential substances can no longer just diffuse into the cells and waste diffuse out of them. So as body size increased, we got dedicated delivery and removal systems because they became necessary. In animals like humans, the primary distribution system is the circulatory system, which consists of tens of thousands of miles, that's a lot, of hollow, tube-like vessels that reach all the tissues in your body. And in us, our circulatory systems have 3 principal functions. They transport, they regulate temperature, and they help protect us from pathogens. So know those 3 functions of the circulatory system and what each of them do. It's just summarizing that. This is showing you red blood cells packed into a capillary. A capillary is like a really, really tiny vein in your body. Okay, no discussion of the circulatory system would be complete without discussing the heart. Humans have a 4-chambered heart. There are other heart designs that we could talk about in other animals, but for the sake of time, we'll just focus on us since you're non-majors and you probably care the most about humans. So the human heart is at the center of the circulatory system, obviously, and it's one of the most durable and reliable pumps ever produced. So how we get rid of carbon dioxide and get oxygen back is through this 4-chambered heart shown here in that circle. You see the chamber called the right atrium, and then the right ventricle, and then the left atrium and the left ventricle. So those are the 4 chambers. Everything here in blue is showing you blood that does not have very much oxygen in it, so that's going to be carbon dioxide rich blood. Everything here in red is showing you oxygen rich blood. This is part of your homework. There's some confusion, I think in part because the way diagrams have to be color coded, that sometimes your blood is blue and it absolutely is never blue. This is just for the sake of diagramming things so that you know like where the blood is coming into the heart with oxygen rich blood versus going out with carbon dioxide, or vice versa, depending on which part of the heartbeat we're talking about. Alright, so you probably want to take notes on this. So how we get rid of the carbon dioxide and get oxygen back. The blood is pumped first from the right ventricle. So find that right ventricle on your chart. So blood pumps from the right ventricle to the lungs, so up through this large area here, so out these 2 to the lungs. And then once it passes through the lungs, those alveoli are going to put oxygen into the blood and take that carbon dioxide out of the blood. So then oxygenated blood returns from the lungs back to the left atrium, so here. Then it goes down to the left ventricle, which is here. Alright, so now we have oxygenated blood because we passed it through the lungs and got oxygen into it. That's awesome. But now we got to get it through the whole body so all the cells in the whole body can get oxygen, right? So what happens is the heart's going to pump, and all that blood in the left ventricle is going to be pumped out through this aorta, which is the largest artery you have. And it goes from the aorta out through all of these arteries through your whole body. And then lastly, oxygen poor blood. So oxygen gets delivered to the cells, but then the carbon dioxide also needs to get dumped back into the blood to get them out through our lungs. So the oxygen poor blood comes back to the heart to get out through the lungs by coming into the right atrium, either through the superior or the inferior vena cava. Those are just two large blood vessels. The superior is going to be all of the cells above the heart in our body, and the inferior is going to be bringing back all that oxygen poor blood from all the cells below the heart in our body. And it gets back through veins. So A, artery, means away, so you have oxygen-rich blood going away from the heart. And then V for veins, it's coming back, and that blood in your veins is going to be oxygen poor and carbon dioxide rich. These four chambers get kind of confusing. The way I remember an atrium versus a ventricle, an atrium is a room where you kind of just are held and sit around. So this is where blood kind of sits around and waits till it can flow into the ventricle. And the ventricle is where it always going to be pushed out of to go somewhere. So when the heart contracts, remember it's a huge muscle, it squeezes, that blood's going to get pushed out. So in the case of the right ventricle, it's going to get pushed out to go to the lungs, or in the case of the left ventricle, it's going to go pushed out through the aorta to go to all the cells in the body. You can hear your heart working. It goes lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub over and over. And it's always those same two sounds. And those are the sounds that a doctor hears when using that stethoscope. What is the source? It's not actually the contraction of the heart. You're not hearing the heart itself contract. The muscle contraction itself doesn't make very much noise. The sound actually comes from two sets of valves, V-A-L-V-E, valves, that help keep blood flowing in the proper direction. So remember I said blood pools here in the left ventricle, and then it needs to, the atrium, and then it goes into the ventricle to get pushed out. Well, once the blood gets down from the atrium into the ventricle, you don't want to go back up into the atrium, right? You want it to get pushed out either through the aorta or through these veins to the lungs. So once the blood is pushed from the atrium into the ventricles, these valves will close, keeping it from going back up. So those valves opening and closing to let blood flow from the atrium into the ventricle, opening and then closing here to keep it from flowing back, that's actually the sound you're hearing. Is those valves slamming shut, kind of like doors. This is a video I suggest you watch starting 3 minutes in. That whole process I just explained to you with the heart and how blood comes in and where it goes out and the 4 different chambers is very confusing. So you can watch that other video and have animations that you can follow along and watch it as many times as you want to. It'll be more informative than this. So what is the purpose of the heart valves? The answer is number 3. So it's prevent backflow of the blood from the ventricles getting back up into the atrium. Alright, the human heart, it's an extremely durable pump at the center of our circulatory system. Sends blood through the body, first to the lungs for loading up with oxygen, and then through all the tissues and organs of the body. And there are valves in the heart that keep blood flowing in one direction. Our hearts also have a small piece of a modified muscle tissue called the sinoatrial. You can just call it the SA node. It initiates the regular rhythmic contractions of the heart. Unlike most muscular tissue, which must be stimulated by a nerve before it contracts, the SA node spontaneously fires an electrical impulse that initiates contraction in the heart muscle. It is the pacemaker of the heart. So if you've ever known anyone that needs a pacemaker, it's because their SA node isn't firing properly to keep their heart contracting like it should be and when it should be. So again, the SA node initiates a carefully choreographed muscle contraction that results in the efficient pumping of blood to the lungs and to the rest of the body, as just described. Beginning just above the right atrium, the electrical impulse of the SA node quickly spreads to the left atrium as well. Both of those atriums are going to contract, and that contraction is actually what pushes the blood into those ventricles. The atrium then enter a relaxation phase after the contraction, and the wave of contraction continues, passing down the center of the heart and in between the two ventricles. On reaching the bottom of the heart, the contraction appears to almost bounce back upward, causing a deep contraction that pushes the blood up from the bottom of both of those ventricles. So now the blood's getting pushed out of the ventricles into the pulmonary arteries in the case of the right ventricle, or the aorta in the case of the left ventricle. Much like squeezing a tube of toothpaste from the bottom up. Those ventricles then enter a relaxation phase, and the SA node starts the contraction anew. So contraction of the atrium, meaning the two atriums, atria is just plural, and the ventricles is orchestrated by what? The answer is the sinoatrial, or SA node, number 4. Alright, so note the heart contraction begins with the SA node and the right atrium. It then quickly spreads to the left atrium, and those atriums contract, pushing blood down into the ventricles. And then that contraction is going to pass into the ventricles, contracting and getting pushed up out of the ventricles, either through the pulmonary arteries or the aorta. I went through all that so you can understand blood pressure. Additional information about heart health can be gained with the measurement of blood pressure. And blood pressure measures the force with which blood flows through a person's arteries. So the force that is getting pushed away from the heart through the arteries into the rest of the body. The force tells us the magnitude of each heart's contraction and gives important clues about an individual's cardiovascular health. There are two different parts to a blood pressure reading. The first is called systolic pressure. So you know there's two numbers, there's like one number over another number. So that first one is your systolic pressure. That's the pressure when the heart contracts to push the blood into the arteries. The powerful contraction pumps blood into the arteries, momentarily causing them to stretch as they accommodate the large pulse of blood getting put into them. The second blood pressure reading is called the diastolic pressure. This is a measure of the force that blood exerts on the artery walls while the heart is between beats. Because blood isn't being actively pumped at that moment, the diastolic pressure is always lower than the systolic pressure. So now you know what those two numbers are. The systolic is that first number, and it's higher because that is measuring the pressure from the heart contracting. And that second one is the diastolic, and it's lower because the heart isn't actively contracting at that time. It's just measuring the force through the arteries when the heart is at rest between contractions. For example, if your blood pressure is 120/80, it means the systolic pressure is 120 and the diastolic pressure is 80. The units of measure, in case you're curious how we get those weird numbers, is we're actually measuring milliliters of mercury. In the case of the first blood pressure measuring contraptions, they put mercury in there. Kind of like how the oldest, what am I trying to say? The thermometers to measure temperature had mercury in them. We don't do that anymore because mercury is toxic. But anyway, So they had mercury in them, and then the force pushing up against that mercury, how far up that mercury would go, is how they'd measure it. So anyway, that's the weird units. Blood pressure above 120/80 is a potential health hazard called hypertension. Normal blood pressure, your systolic should be less than 120 and your diastolic should be less than 80. If you have pre-hypertension, your systolic is between 120 and 139, or your diastolic is between 80 and 89. And then stage 1 hypertension, your systolic and diastolic would be even higher. And then stage 2 hypertension, it would be 160 or greater for your systolic, or 100 or greater for your diastolic. So now you kind of know when you're at the doctor's office what all that shenanigans is about when they are taking your blood pressure. So if your blood pressure is 140/90, which of these apply? The answer is number 5. So the pressure when your heart contracts is 140. That's your systolic. That's what it's measuring, is your heart contraction. The pressure when your heart relaxes is 90. That's the diastolic. Your arteries are being stretched more than normal. So remember that healthy range is around 120, and 140 is well above 120. So that means your arteries are getting stretched more than they should, and that's why that systolic number is higher than it should be, which is an indicator that your heart is working harder than it should be. So the answer is all the above. Reminding you, blood pressure reading consists of 2 measures. The first is the systolic, force the blood exerts on the artery wall when the heart contracts. The second is the diastolic. It's a force that blood exerts on the artery wall while the heart is between beats at rest. With high blood pressure, that means the heart must be working harder at all times. Also, the arteries could be losing some of their elasticity and health risks are increased. So what is blood actually made of? Blood is not just red blood cells. Less than half of blood is red blood cells. Blood is actually a salty, protein-rich mixture of cells and fluid with a consistency like that of motor oil. Of course, not the same color. Blood's functions revolve primarily around its transport and delivery capabilities, including its transport of respiratory gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide. It also transports vitamins and minerals, nutrients, hormones. It transports cells of the immune system and metabolic wastes. It also helps to maintain body temperature. So this is showing you different cells in the blood. There's also a lot of liquid in the blood, but the cells could be 3 different types. The red blood cells, which transport oxygen because they're full of that hemoglobin that has iron in it. The white blood cells, they run around looking for pathogens to destroy. And then the platelets. The platelets' job is to form blood clots if a cut occurs. When an individual has too few red blood cells, anemia develops, or if they have too little iron in those red blood cells, anemia develops. Iron deficiency is the most common cause of this condition because red blood cells deliver oxygen to the body's cells. One consequence of anemia is a reduction in the oxygen available to cells. Essentially, you're suffocating your cells because they're not getting oxygen, which causes people with anemia to feel tired and run down. A reduction in the number of red blood cells is also associated with an increased susceptibility to infection because you have a weakening of the immune system's ability to mount a response to pathogens. Iron is a critical element that enables oxygen to be carried by red blood cells. If iron is in short supply, red blood cells can't deliver sufficient oxygen to tissues when it's needed. An old folk remedy for anemia, which actually worked, was sipping liquid daily from a jug containing rusty iron nails in water. I don't suggest you do that. I suggest you take an iron supplement. But they didn't understand the biology behind why it was working, but it did work because iron was getting supplemented into those individuals when they did that. Even food cooked in an iron skillet has a significantly increased iron content. Shown here, like this iron skillet. With more than 50,000 miles of blood vessels in our bodies, so that's how much length blood vessels you have in your body right now, 50,000 miles, it's inevitable that there will be occasional cuts or punctures, and fortunately we have platelets ready to swing into action when that does happen. This is reminding you all the things that blood transports. Our blood cells are continually made through bone marrow. So sometimes people with sickle cell anemia get bone marrow transplants, which in itself is pretty risky, but sometimes it's necessary to try. And you have different types of cells in your blood. You have red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. The leading cause of death in the United States is cardiovascular disease. Heart attacks are brought on by an interruption in the blood flow through one of the coronary arteries. The coronary arteries are the blood vessels that deliver oxygen and nutrients to the heart muscle itself. So all the cells in your body need to get oxygenated blood, but your heart also needs oxygen too to keep working because it's full of cells, right? When cells in the heart muscles are deprived of oxygen, the heart may beat irregularly, or it could cease to beat altogether, and then the heart muscles cells are deprived of oxygen, they will die. This has serious and long-term implications because heart cells are among the rare cells of your body that do not reproduce themselves. So red blood is continually being made by your bone marrow, so you can lose some blood and you're okay, but you really can't lose any of your heart cells and be okay. They don't get remade. Heart attacks rarely strike out of the blue. Although the heart attack itself is a sudden event, it usually occurs after decades of progressive deterioration of the arteries and other degradations of the circulatory system, collectively known as cardiovascular disease. This is showing you disease of the blood vessels on the right. So fatty deposits are accumulating here in these plaques inside of the arteries, which is clogging them, so the blood can't get through. So the heart keeps pumping harder and harder and having to work too hard to try and get enough blood through that tiny little opening, or enough blood can't get back to the heart through those coronary arteries to get enough oxygen to the heart cells themselves. That's called atherosclerosis. One of the things that form those fatty deposits in the arteries, those plaques, is cholesterol. So if you have too much cholesterol in your diet, particularly bad cholesterol, you get these plaques building up in the inside of the arteries. Cholesterol comes in two major forms: LDL, which stands for low density lipoprotein, and HDL, which stands for high density lipoprotein. LDL is nicknamed the quote bad cholesterol, and it's called the bad cholesterol because it tends to adhere to artery walls a lot more than the HDL. So you can have cholesterol, but you should definitely limit the amount of bad cholesterol you have, the amount of LDL. So if you are somebody that has been told by your doctor that you may be at risk for atherosclerosis, either because of your diet and or genetics of your family, you should pay a lot of attention to the LDL composition of foods and limit your intake. HDL is nicknamed good cholesterol because instead of building up, its job is actually to remove cholesterol from arteries and deliver it to the liver cells so it can be broken down. So LDL will build up cholesterol inside of the arteries. HDL will try and scrape it off and take it to the liver to break it down and get rid of it. And that process with the clogging of the arteries is called atherosclerosis. And the consequence of the clogging of the arteries is you don't get oxygen to the heart, and then you can have heart attacks. And in the case of not being able to get oxygen to your brain, that's when you have a stroke. Alright, the last chapter is chapter 22. Should go over sections 3, 7, 8, 10 through 12, and 18. Talk about calories, vitamins, and minerals, how we extract energy and nutrients from food, and why what we eat has profound effects on our health by looking at the example of diabetes. Have you ever gone a whole day without eating, or have you ever spent a few weeks trying to reduce your caloric intake? Living in a state of hunger can be torturous. that's what this picture is about. This study done in the early 1990s, 8 human guinea pigs learned the hard way by living in this biosphere, which was a self-contained 3.2 acre world filled with plants and animals. It was designed to explore sustainable living with minimal environmental impact. They took part in an experiment on the effects of a low-calorie diet, and it turned out that they became very unhappy. They argued constantly and frequently squabbled over meal portions in what they dubbed the Hunger Dome. What are calories? People talk about calories all the time. How many calories do you eat? And you need to get less calories, and they're on the back of every food label, but what the heck are they? The energetic value of food is measured in very small amounts of energy called calories. A single calorie is defined as the energy required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius, which can be a bit confusing. So in discussing human consumption, the term calorie actually refers to kilocalories, meaning 1,000 calories. So when we say a calorie, it actually stands for 1,000 calories, which, don't panic, it's not like you're eating 1,000,000 calories a day. So in the label on a package of cookies says that the cookie has 100 calories. The cookie actually provides 100 kilocalories, or 100,000 calories. The minimum amount of calories needed to run the body for a day, just without moving, so if you just sat on your couch all day, that would be called your basal metabolic rate, or your BMR. It refers to the amount of energy expended at rest, with no food in the digestive tract in a neutral temperature environment. Your BMR can be roughly approximated as 1 calorie per hour per gram of body weight. Alright? So that's the number you should care more about what a calorie is. It's in units of energy our body needs to do its business, and in general you're going to need 1 calorie per hour per gram of body weight you have. So that's about 1,400 calories per day for a woman if she weighs 120 pounds, and about 1,700 calories per day for a man weighing 160. The difference between the sexes is mostly a function of the difference in body size. So the male has more cells to power. So the larger you are, the more calories you consume to retain that body weight, because you have to feed all those cells. Of course, if you decrease your caloric intake, you're going to lose some weight. So to function well, living organisms need sufficient energy, measured in kilocalories, but we always just call them calories. The minimal energy needed by an individual not engaged in activity is called your basal metabolic rate, your BMR. So if you're somebody who runs several hours a week, or you're somebody who lifts weights every day, those individuals are consuming a lot more calories. Vitamins and minerals. We talk about take your vitamins all the time, but what are they? They are chemical elements needed in very small amounts for proteins in your body to function properly, to do their job. For example, if we look at that protein hemoglobin inside of the red blood cells, it needs iron, right? So if you don't get any iron in your diet, then the hemoglobin in the red blood cells can't do its job. Both vitamins and minerals are essential dietary components. The difference between the two categories is one of chemistry. So vitamins are organic, meaning they're carbon-containing molecules, whereas minerals are inorganic elements. 3 features are common to all vitamins and minerals. One is they don't yield any usable energy, but what they do is they serve as collaborators with proteins to let them do their job to catalyze a wide range of reactions in your body. Number 2, they need to be consumed in much smaller amounts than proteins, carbs, and fats in our diet. This is because they tend to serve as catalysts, and they can be recycled and used again and again by proteins, so you don't need to keep replenishing them with large amounts. Number 3, if we have a healthy diet, we tend to consume sufficient quantities of vitamins and minerals directly in our food. So if you have a balanced, healthy diet, you don't, unless you have some sort of specific health issue, you don't really need vitamins and minerals. You're just spending money. 13 vitamins are essential to the human diet. They're shown in this chart along with the common food source and role in the body. So if you completely lack one of these food sources, then yeah, maybe you should be concerned enough to spend your money to take those vitamins or minerals. But if you had a healthy, well-balanced diet and you're able to eat everything, like let's say you're not lactose intolerant so you can eat dairy products, then you're good to go. All the minerals on this list are essential. Minerals are elements. They cannot be manufactured by the body, so they must be obtained through our diet. Let's see an example here. Iodine. So iodine, you probably get it in your diet through table salt actually. So if you've ever noticed that the salt you buy says iodized salt on it, you can buy iodized or non-iodized salt. What that means is iodine is added to that salt so that you can get it into your diet, because not a lot of people are eating shellfish. So if you don't eat shellfish or fish, you do not want to just use non-iodized salt. You want to make sure you're buying iodized salt at the store to get that mineral in your diet. So currently more than half of the U.S. population takes regular vitamin supplements. Usually taking vitamin supplements is a costly but harmless behavior. The consumption of increasing amounts of vitamins often just leads to a plateau of maximum benefit, after which greater consumption has no additional benefits. You're just wasting your money. Occasionally, though, I do want to say that taking vitamins and mineral supplements could be harmful if you take too many. Usually it's not, though, because above a certain point, you could get a toxicity because they're going to build up in your system. For example, excessive consumption of vitamin A can lead to hair loss in men, while overconsumption of vitamin D can lead to growth issues. Liver damage is another common result of excessive vitamin and mineral consumption. Under special circumstances, however, supplementation is necessary. So again, as long as you're eating a healthy diet, you don't need to spend your money on vitamins and potentially take too many of them and have any negative side effects. So women with extremely heavy menstrual flow may need iron supplementation. So you're losing more blood than you should be. So you're losing all that iron from those red blood cells. Postmenopausal women and those allergic to milk may need calcium supplementation to avoid osteoporosis, which is bone degradation. Pregnant and breastfeeding women, of course, need supplementation to help support the fetus or growing infant. Pregnant women may need additional folate to prevent neural tube defects. So folate is an important vitamin that women get in those prenatal vitamins to prevent their baby from having developmental issues. People with limited milk consumption and low sun exposure may need additional vitamin D. People with vitamin D, not only do you get it from your diet, but you can get it directly from the sun. People with absorption problems may need vitamin and mineral supplementation to overcome the lowered absorption. Okay, so just reiterating what vitamins and minerals are and what they do in your body. We extract all of these calories, vitamins, and minerals from our food. So now we'll talk about the digestive system. We convert food into nutrients in 4 steps. The human digestive system is like an assembly line running backwards. Imagine starting with an assembled car and dismantling it into its many parts: the tires, doors, windshield, steering wheel. The food entering the digestive system is like the intact car. It enters the assembly line and then passes through 4 distinct phases, during which the food is progressively chewed up and broken down. The nutrients are absorbed by the body, and the non-usable portion of the raw material is discarded as waste products. In the next several sections, we'll examine in detail the stages in the processing of food: ingestion, digestion, absorption, and elimination. Food is fuel, but it's useless to an animal until it has been completely broken down into its chemical constituents. Only then can it be absorbed into the bloodstream and used by cells. The process of dismantling large pieces of food, physically and chemically breaking them down into chunks, is digestion. It occurs primarily in the stomach and small intestines. And before Digestion, we have ingestion. That's when you're going to be chewing up your food. And your saliva and just the physical process of chewing it up will help break it up so it can go into the stomach and start digestion. Digestion only begins in the mouth and stomach. Most chemical digestion actually occurs in the small intestines. A long thin tube connected to the stomach. The small intestines is about 20 feet long. It's not very small. It's called small because of the diameter compared to the large intestines, but it's much longer than the large intestines. There's 20 feet of your small intestines winding around your abdominal cavity. And it's there that the job of chemical digestion starts. Once the opening, called the sphincter at the end of the stomach, relaxes, it creates an opening through which small amounts of that chyme are pushed into the small intestines. And then that chyme is gradually digested by the small intestines with help of chemicals that are added from the pancreas and the liver. The pancreas is nestled at the point where the stomach connects to the small intestines. It plays a central role in digestion by secreting pancreatic juice into the small intestine. The juice is a mixture of chemicals that neutralize the acid from the stomach. So remember, your stomach is really, really acidic. Your small intestines is not as acidic at all. And so the pancreas helps to neutralize it and make it less acidic. It also, the pancreatic juice has enzymes in it, which are just proteins that they digest carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Another organ that assists the small intestines with digestion is the liver, which produces bile. Bile is a juice that aids in the breakdown of fats. The liver sends the bile to the gallbladder, and from there it passes through a small opening into the small intestines where the bile is used in fat digestion. So know all these parts of digestion, all the players. So from the stomach down into the small intestines, the job of the pancreas, the job of the liver to make the bile that's stored in the gallbladder that pushes that bile into the small intestine. Alright, so the pancreas secretes enzymes that digest what? The answer is number 4. And this is going to go back to previous chapters. So when we were talking about breaking down proteins into their little parts, what are we talking about needing to break it down into to absorb? And the answer is number 2, amino acids. So if you remember back to those first few chapters of macromolecules, proteins are made up of amino acids. Digestion is what we just focused on. It's a process of dismantling large pieces of food physically, chemically. It occurs primarily in the small intestines with help from that liver and pancreas. The structure of the small intestine is specialized to increase the surface area available for absorption of nutrients. In order to be absorbed, a molecule must be in direct contact with the surface of the intestinal cell. Therefore, the more cells, the more molecules can be absorbed. The surface area is increased in 4 ways. Number 1, the small intestines is about 20 feet long, so that's a lot of surface area. Number 2, rather than being straight and smooth, it's a tube that has a lot of folds in it. You can see that in these pictures. Number 3, the interior lining, so the inside of the small intestines is made up of thousands of small finger-like projections called villi. They create lots of nooks and crannies where that chyme broken up in the stomach can come into contact with cells in the small intestines. 4, each of the cells along the villi has hundreds of its own thread-like projections called microvilli. So those create even more nooks and crannies that allow even more molecules to come into direct contact with the small intestine surface area. The molecules that can be absorbed by the small intestines include simple sugars, short proteins, individual amino acids, fatty acids, vitamins, minerals, and water. Once the food has been digested, it is taken into the intestinal surface through the villi on the cells. The nutrients are drawn into the cell and expelled out into the other side into the bloodstream. So this is where digestion and circulatory system come together. So we already talked about how circulatory and respiratory systems come together to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. Here, The digestive system and the circulatory system are coming together to get nutrients into the bloodstream to take through to all the other cells in the body. So understand the absorption process in general, especially all that surface area stuff, and how the digestive system interacts with the circulatory and why. The last phase in the breakdown of food is elimination. It takes place as what's left of the chyme, which is mostly undigestible material. It leaves the small intestines and enters the large intestines, which is also sometimes called the colon. Much larger in diameter than the small intestines. It's about 3 inches wide versus 1 inch in the small intestines. But it's only 3 to 6 feet long compared to the 20 feet of the small intestine. It also, what the large intestine does is it serves to absorb water, salt, and some vitamins. And then, of course, anything that can't be absorbed through the small or large intestines comes out the other end as fecal material. When fiber is consumed, it increases fecal mass. With additional mass, more water is attracted, speeding the movement of all that chyme and food through the colon. It also softens the feces because of that increase in the water, making it easier to eliminate. That's why too much fiber can lead to diarrhea, but a little bit of fiber can soften the stool. Fiber also binds to bile, so that's a really important job of fiber. That bile that's secreted by the gallbladder via the liver into the small intestines, fiber can bind to it, causing some of it to be eliminated and reducing the body's ability to absorb cholesterol from food. You don't want to absorb too much cholesterol, right? Because it clogs your arteries. It's important to achieve just the right balance of water absorption in the large intestines. If too much is absorbed, the remaining indigestible material becomes too solid and can't be moved easily through the last part of the digestive system, causing constipation. But alternatively, if too little water absorption occurs, the body loses more water through diarrhea. Alright, so go ahead and answer this question. Grandma always says, eat your fiber. It'll keep you regular. Why is she right? The answer is number 3. So 1 is wrong because it increases fecal mass. 2 is wrong because it increases fecal softening. 4 is correct. It does bind to bile, but that's not what helps keep you regular. That's just going to help with you not having too much bile in your system and not absorbing too much cholesterol. Alright, so the last phase of food breakdown takes place mostly in large intestines, and that's where the water and the last of the nutrients are absorbed before the remaining material is defecated. I want to wrap up talking about diabetes because it's probably affected almost all of your lives in some way. More than 10 million Americans and 100 million people worldwide have problems with their insulin response system, and that whole process of having an issue with your insulin is referred to as diabetes. And these problems are chiefly of 2 types. Either number 1, the pancreas doesn't secrete enough insulin. So another job of the pancreas is to secrete insulin. So if you have type 1 diabetes, the pancreas doesn't secrete enough insulin in response to an increase in blood sugar. Or number 2, the pancreas secretes plenty of insulin, but the cells of the body don't actually recognize that it's there and they don't respond to it. Usually that's due to a decrease in the number of glucose receptors on the cells. In both cases, blood sugar remains way too high, and a host of problems can result from persistence of glucose in the bloodstream. The first type of diabetes is believed to be an autoimmune disease and is most often diagnosed in children or young adults. Generally, people with type 1 diabetes have a pancreas that doesn't secrete enough insulin in response to an increase in blood sugar. The second type, diabetes type 2, is about 10 times more common and generally develops after the age of 40. And in about 90% of cases, it's a consequence of obesity. So this one's more preventable than type 1. It appears that chronic and excessive amounts of sugar in the diet, which then get into your bloodstream, reduce the sensitivity and or the number of insulin receptors that help recognize that the insulin is around to decrease and control the amount of sugar in your blood. This causes even greater release of insulin, which can ultimately wear out the insulin-producing cells of the pancreas. So digesting and absorbing food leads to an increase in the amount of glucose in the bloodstream, which triggers the release of insulin by the pancreas. Problems with regulation of blood sugar, called diabetes, affects millions of people and are caused by heredity and poor diet. That's it.